the end of the year. And it's a time when, in general, we're thinking about holidays and friends and families and celebrating, maybe good food. And just enjoying ourselves. It's a time of enjoyment. But I think there's another view that we can take about the end of the year, because this is the time when the days are growing short. We've just passed the solstice, the winter solstice. The trees are bare, light is fading. And it's nature's way, this end of the year, the winter, of bringing things to an end, to completion. And I think there's a message for us here. Even as we think and we celebrate the holidays, I think there's something else, another view that we should be taking as well, that we can take. And that is considering endings, completions, and what they mean in our own lives. So that's what I want to focus on tonight, and that is endings. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about dying and other endings. Spiritual practice, how we hold this in spiritual practice, and then also new beginnings. I know many of us here are middle-aged, or maybe just a little bit older, a tad older than middle-aged. And you know, for us, issues about dying and the thought of dying becomes maybe more natural, maybe more commonplace as we get older. But even for those of you who are younger than middle-aged, I think it is something that is appropriate and important to think about. I know when you're younger, you know, it's so natural. Maybe, of course, we all know we're going to die. But I think for younger people, it's so much easier. It's an intellectual knowledge, but it's hard to bring it into reality because in the ordinary course of things, we hope it won't happen for a very long time. We never know, as the Buddha said, all things are impermanent. But if we're graced, our life is graced with a normal span, it's not going to happen for a while. And still it is important for all of us to contemplate in our own life what the reality of death may be. As the Buddha said, all things are impermanent. It's a beautiful scripture in the Zen tradition from the Diamond Sutra. It says, "Thus shall ye know of all this fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer's cloud, a child's laugh, a phantom and a dream." This is fleeting world. It's here now. And all of a sudden, it isn't. And we would never know. We can never know when that's going to happen. So whatever your age, I think that it's appropriate for us all to contemplate, especially at this ending of the year, to contemplate what death means in your life. A few weeks ago, maybe several weeks ago now, we had our IMCC tea for our new members. And at that tea, three of us were sitting, and we began talking about death. And our question was, whether we would, if we had a choice, we would rather know that we had a year to live, or whether we would die right away. Now that made me sound morbid to you, that we'd be sitting there and miss tea, but we were talking about this, and we each responded. But it is kind of an inspiration, and I thought we could do an exercise this evening that I would like to guide you in. And that is, I'd like us to do an inquiry and ask you if you would close your eyes and for a moment imagine that you knew, you had just gotten a diagnosis, you have a year to live. And I invite you to consider what is it you might change in your life, in the way you live it, if you knew you had a year to live. What would you do now? What would you do differently? Maybe eliminate some things. What would you say to those you love or maybe to people with whom you've had disagreements? Where might you extend forgiveness? And now I invite you to consider, instead of 1 year, what if it was 6 months? A shorter amount of time. Then what? How would you live your life? What would you do? Let's go way shorter than 6 months. What about if you have heard or you knew somehow you probably had 1 week to live? And what if it was today? You knew you had 24 hours. What would you do in these 24 hours? What is it you feel is truly important in your life, and you would do it in these 24 hours? So thank you for thinking into this, and maybe it's something you'll want to continue to think into later on. And I ask you to notice, did it change? Did your answers change about what you might do in your life if you knew you had a year? And what if the time was shorter? Let's go way out to 24 hours, 1 day. How did you change what you were thinking about, what you need to be doing in this life? What's important? And the question is, are we, each of us, living our life in the light of death? Living in the light of death changes perspective on life when we live in the light of death. What I want to do tonight is to read you something. It is some comments by a woman who deeply has contemplated this, living in the light of her own death. Her name is Susan Babbitt, and she teaches, she's on the professor in the faculty at Kingston University Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm going to read you, it's a fairly long passage. She said, I was first diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer in August 2003. Until that point in my life, I had no experience with illness or medicine. I'd not even had the flu. The cancer diagnosis was a brutal assault on my sense of who I was. All of a sudden, I was a seriously ill person. I looked for ways to get through this experience. My friend Maureen, who was also going through cancer and who was doing well after treatments, died. I suddenly understood that the only way I'd be able to live with cancer was to come to terms with the fact that my existence or non-existence was ultimately out of my control. It was clear to me that I had to be able to look at what was happening for what it was, to accept that death was indeed possible. I decided that I wanted to be able to expect the worst-case scenario and to live with it. That is, to live my life with the awareness of what could very well happen to me. Practically, this seemed to be the most reasonable thing to do, but at the time I knew nothing about meditation or vipassana. And by the way, she uses the word vipassana over and over, and for those of you who are new to this practice, what we are doing in what we call mindfulness meditation or insight meditation is also called vipassana. It's an ancient word from the Pali language. Same thing. She uses that word over and over. At that time, I knew nothing about meditation or vipassana. I was surprised to learn that vipassana is precisely the practice of looking at your reality just as it is, not as you want it to be. It is the systematic observation of your entire physical and mental experience. You incrementally gain thereby an experiential understanding of the real nature of your existence, which is, after all, impermanent. There is no turning of bad things into good things, as so many seem to try to do with disease and death. Instead, you look at the way things are, which is the way of the entire universe, constantly changing. And when you gain such an awareness, which must be experiential, meaning that it must be felt, it makes no sense to identify yourself with either the good or the bad, and therefore become debilitated by either desperate hope or by desperate fear. By the summer of 2005, after chemotherapy treatments, my life was getting back to normal. I had regained the use of my leg and had fully returned to work. I was getting ready for my sabbatical when, in September, my leg became stiffer. On the 1st of October, which was actually the beginning of a 3-month sabbatical, I found another lump on the leg. I knew even before the doctors did that it was recurrent cancer. The whole month of October was extremely difficult because I knew the cancer was back, but I didn't know whether it had gone anywhere. They couldn't do the CT scan to see if it had spread until October 28. Those 4 weeks were hell. My career would again be interrupted, and I was sure that this time I would lose my leg. What do you do with all these thoughts? All you have is your mind, and the fears that go round and round. Where do you go to flee from your mind? I thought that if I hadn't learned meditation, I'd have gone crazy. I could easily have fallen into a deep pit of despair, and nobody would have blamed me, for it would have been completely reasonable. Instead, I would sit among those strong, debilitating emotions, concentrate my mind, and observe the sensations sometimes, most of the night. And eventually the fears would loosen their hold. I'd found that I could coexist with the fears and grief, like looking straight into darkness, and eventually feel some peace, knowing that it had to be that way, at least for now. I did manage to function that month, somewhat normally. We all know intellectually that we can die at any moment, but we don't believe this truth actually applies to us. It's abstract. We believe it, but we don't feel the truth of what we believe. And it plays no real role in how we live our lives. It's a truth that does not matter to our lives. Meditation is the experience, moment after moment, hour after hour, of the uncertain nature of existence. And in undergoing such an experience, death cannot be abstract, for its reality is there in each moment of real awareness. I began radiation treatments at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. I stayed at the hospital lodge for 5 weeks, going twice a day to the hospital for this very painful radiation. I didn't feel like I had any kind of balance during this time. I was in a lot of pain. At the time, I didn't have much peace of mind, but I remembered what one of my Vipassana teachers had told me. If you can't maintain your balance of mind, just be aware that you can't maintain the balance of mind, and you'll still be moving ahead. This is a powerful part of the Buddha's teaching. It is not about being immediately successful. When things are going badly, I can still look at my reality as it is, aware of its ultimately impermanent nature, and start again right there. The surgery to remove the tumor and save my leg was 13 hours long, and the recovery was difficult. Finally, I went home and began physiotherapy. It was now April 2006. The cancer was gone, spring had arrived, and I was becoming mobile again. But just 1 week after I left the hospital, they told me that the cancer was in my lungs. This was devastating news, because when the cancer has metastasized, the prognosis is poor. They told me I had a 20% chance of living another 5 years. And that, of course, was hard to hear. I realized that I had to look at the fear and disappointment and just wait. As I accepted the situation, I realized that what was hard about the idea of dying was not that I would die soon at 53 rather than at 83, as I had always expected, but that I would die at all. It was not premature death that was hard, but death itself. They did the first lung surgery in May 2006 and removed 7 malignant tumors. Then almost immediately after, in June, there were more nodules showing in the scan. They did not recommend surgery again that summer, so I returned to teaching in the fall, and I was happy to go back. A colleague and friend of mine later asked me why I wanted to go back, knowing as I did that my life would likely end soon. And I told her that indeed there had been a time in the summer of 2006 when I thought that perhaps I should do something special with the rest of my now shortened life. Maybe travel to some new places or write some important book. But when I reflected on this, the idea struck me as ridiculous. I did not regret losing my life because of the things I might have done or accomplished had I lived. I regretted losing my life because of life itself, the moment-by-moment experience of it. I had once thought interesting the question of what I would do if I knew I had only months to live. But when I ended up in that situation, there was no such question. All I wanted to do were the ordinary everyday things I had always done. I can't say this came as a conclusion of Vipassana practice because I know other cancer patients, not Vipassana practitioners, who have come to the same conclusion. Yet I do think it a result of Vipassana that this truth was so easy to accept and apply to what was left as my life. And I am certain that it was because of my meditation that there was no sense whatsoever of great sadness about it. There was something tempting. There was something tempting in the idea that death should be dramatic, that something important should be done or said to mark the event, as if to underline the meaning of it all. Yet all I wanted, for whatever was left of my very ordinary life, was the quiet, simple awareness of its most mundane aspects. No extra fun or excitement, and certainly no drama or sentimentality. What is ordinary is all the more miraculous when death is close. This is a truth I experienced through my Vipassana practice. So I went back to teaching and found it somehow easy in a way it had not been before. I was doing what I had to do, what I had always done, what I believed in, but I was not concerned about the importance of it. This is not to say that it wasn't important. What I was doing in teaching was important and meaningful to me in the way it had always been. But it was not important that it was important and meaningful. Let me read that again. This is not to say it wasn't important. What I was doing and teaching was important and meaningful to me in the way it had always been. But it was not important that it was important and meaningful. What this means is that I found that I was living my life without watching myself live my life, without telling myself mental stories about how and why I was living my life. Some of my relations were much easier and more direct. Then, in the middle of October, almost immediately after I had been told by the oncologist that everything indeed was okay, I got the news that no, there was a large tumor near my heart. The news had come in a radiologist's report, and they had missed it in the previous scans. So this was the news I received in early November 2007. Maybe the most powerful thing that happens to one when one practices meditation daily is the ego falls away without noticing it. In fact, it seems to be a part of the nature of the experience of losing the ego and becoming more aware of the present as a result, that no one notices it. I think this is one way that people get it wrong about mindfulness, which is a popular topic now. They make such an effort to be mindful of what they are doing that they are concentrating more on the effort they are making. But the ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi said that when the shoe fits, you don't notice it. When you practice meditation day after day, your mind becomes quieter and, as a result, more observant. And you become less concerned with what it means to be mindful. You just are. And when you are in fact mindful, aware of the present moment, you're not concerned about yourself because the self falls away. It has to. But this only happens with practice after time. Without that slow, patient process, loss of ego, you can't really live in the present because you're constantly concerned with what it means, mostly for yourself, to practice awareness of the present moment. When you really understand that your life only has meaning in the present, those questions about self-importance don't matter. And you become free from debilitating, mostly fearful self-analysis. If the effort toward mindfulness is a concern for self, then it's really not mindfulness at all, at least not in the liberating sense the Buddha taught. So Susan Babbitt, and I will say that she is still alive and she's still teaching at the University of Queens in Ontario. So when I read this, I just was really blown away by the fact of how deeply she touched. She touched into really the central truth of what our practice is about. And I thought I would just like to make a few comments around what she said. Not that I'm going to improve on what she said, but I just don't want to let it all go. So I think that for a few further comments, since she touched on the timeless awareness, and I think that is a key, just a key element. This is finally where our meditation takes us. This day or week after week of watching your breath, noticing your thoughts, your feelings. Finally, what's it all about? And Susan Babbitt learned. She watched, and for her, she was watching her body sensations. That's how she had been taught. Her main object was body sensations. Here, sometimes we watch body sensations, as I invited you tonight. Sometimes we talk about watching breath. No problem. All is well. But the main point is not just watching your breath or your body sensations and keep coming back when thoughts arise. That's the mechanism, that's the dynamic, that's the practice. It's not the end. And the end is what Susan Babbitt found. You do that and finally you go past the effort, the awareness of that you're efforting, and you simply become present to what's going on. Become present in a way that she was, this great open awareness where there's no sense of self. She didn't have to sit there and think, now, am I feeling self? Is my ego here? Am I being filled with self? You know, the Buddha said, as we sometimes talk about here, no self is a characteristic of existence. And most people say, what in the world does that mean? Because you know what? Your mind can't understand no self. The mind can't. Why? Because the mind is filled with self. That's what thoughts are, right? Thoughts are self-referencing. Let me say that again. Thoughts are self-referencing. What does that mean? You know, when you think of nation or you think of someone else, you say, I'm not being selfish or self-referencing. But in fact, there's an awareness of the one who is thinking, namely an I, me, self. But what Susan Babbitt is saying, and what she learned, and what our practice teaches us, is that isn't the end. That finally it isn't about the self-referencing. And that's why we keep saying, dropping the thoughts, coming back to simply physical. What are the physical sensations right now? What's going on with the breath? Because finally within that, right there is that shift that can and does happen. That happened for her. That plays into open awareness, where there simply is the isness of every day. Where there is, as she pointed out, the miraculousness of the mundane, of the everyday. Did you notice she didn't have a bucket list, right? She didn't have this list of things that she was going to do in these last months that she might have left to her. It was just right there. She didn't want anything more. It was right there in the present moment. Now, Susan Babbitt was at the time propelled by the urgency of death, and we all know, whether it's something we've read or just can intellectually understand, or maybe that experience of those dear to us who have died. And certainly I remember a case with my mother. I was a caregiver for her, which in fact I talk about in this book that's back there. It was in the summer, and I went to live with her as she was dying of cancer. And I had planted in a little bowl that we had out on the patio, a terracotta bowl, petunias. And she asked me one day if I would bring the petunias in so that she could see them, because I said they were in bloom. Now, my mother had seen petunias for heaven knows how many years. Like we've all seen petunias. You know, there's not an exotic flower. But I brought them in to her, and she looked at them and she said, "Oh, they're so beautiful." And she just was entranced by these petunias and the beauty of the petunias. She too. It was, I think, she was partly propelled by the urgency that death simply imposes on us. But we don't have to be propelled by the urgency of death to begin to experience the beauty of the mundane and of the everyday. And I know perhaps every one of us here has experienced the beauty in small things just in a moment. Our practice enables us, or at least opens the door for us to do this more and more often. The beauty of something small, like looking at a leaf. Not too long ago, it was still summer, looking at the leaves of a trumpet vine. You all see trumpet vines, they grow commonly around here. And holding it up to light and just looking at the veins in that is so incredible. All of the work, this one leaf, and we won't call it work, it was just the natural way of expression, the incredible intricacy of those veins. A little seashell on the beach, and thinking about it as being one of the millions of little sea creatures that lived on the ocean floor and was washed onto the beach, had died there, and it left behind its home, its shell, a perfect little shell. Just the perfection of the moment. And then what about those difficult things that occur in our life? Aren't they perfect too? It's not only the beautiful things, it's everything. It's the everyday moment. I will tell you, I had such a hard time for so many years understanding what that was. To me, it needed to be what was extraordinary for such a long time, or at least what was really beautiful. But this is not what our practice is about. It's about the preciousness, the miracle, as Susan Babbitt called it, the miraculousness of the everyday. She found it. And through our practice, I think each one of us can too. Those moments in which we are truly present, fully present. When this happens, when we are truly present and can be to the small little things in life, I think this is the new opening. These are the openings that the urgency of death can bring to us, and the power that our practice brings to us as well.